Hello, class, and welcome to the second snow day lecture. I'm going to be off at a conference on the 26th of March, so we will not be meeting for class. Instead, I'm going to have this lecture video so that we don't fall behind on the lecture material. I have basically 2 weeks to get through the rest of the material that I want to cover in class. Remember, after this, we move on to Unit 4, which is the independent research projects. Everyone in class will be responsible for scheduling a slot over the next few weeks after spring break in order to present original research that you do. I'll talk more about this in class on Thursday, but you can start scheduling that now. You need to be in groups, 2 or 3 people. You might want to start settling what those groups are now. You might want to start thinking about what you want to do research on now. But we'll talk about that more when I get into class on Thursday. After that, we go into final material. We'll have another debate at the end of class. There'll be another paper to do, but right now I'm still doing a couple more weeks of theory. It'll end in the sort of robot rights discussion next week. Alright, so let's just go ahead and just jump into the material. So we've talked already a little bit about the AI material. We've talked about the history of computation. We've talked about Babbage's engine and the Enigma machine. If I haven't mentioned the Enigma machine, remind me to do that in class. We also talked about these sort of competitions, the Kasparov Deep Blue, the Watson Jeopardy game, the AlphaGo Go games recently. This is all sort of suggestive stuff, but I want to dive into the sort of hardcore arguments about whether or not computers can think. I've actually given one of these arguments already, although this was in the guise of trying to explain how computers work, or what a computation is. This is my babies are computers argument. Remember, if computers are state machines with memory, then babies might also be state machines with memory, in which case the baby's a computer, and that means that you're also a computer. One more argument that I just gave briefly along these lines in class already is just as universality, is the argument from the universality of computers. That if computers, let me go ahead and put myself on the screen here. Yeah, there you go. So if Turing describes a universal computer, and a universal computer can do the work of any other machine, the brain is a machine. And if the universal Turing machine can do the work of any other machine, then the universal Turing machine should be able to do whatever the brain does, and if the brain thinks, then the universal Turing machine should also be able to think. So this is a sort of in-principle argument that Turing machines should be able to compute whatever it is that the brain is computing. But let's give sort of more direct argument about whether or not machines can think. And this is from Turing's own argument. This is in the notes, his 1950 article in Mind, which is a sort of popular philosophy journal. It's an academic philosophy journal, but it's one of the more widely read journals, so he's speaking to a sort of a broad academic audience in this article. The article is Computing Machinery and Intelligence, published 1950. In this, he gives his imitation game, which is nowadays known as the Turing test. When Turing proposes this test, he's actually talking about a sort of a parlor game or sort of dinner party game that would be played by people, before they had TV. So in the dinner party version of this game, you take one male in the group and one female in the group. You have them go into a different room, and then everyone else. The goal is to ask questions of both A and B. You don't know which one's which one's male, which one's female. But everyone's asked questions of A and B, and then you sort of give the questions over to the people in the other room. They answer it, and then you bring the questions back, and then the rest of the dinner party sort of goes through the questions and has to decide whether A is the man or A is the woman, or whether B is the man, B is the woman. So it's the sort of gendered version of the imitation game. Sort of sexy dinner time party sort of thing. It's not sort of totally inappropriate, but the idea is that you're talking about the people's gender, and when you're sort of asking questions to try to figure out what gender the person is. Over the summer, I teach a summer high school class for philosophy, and we go through the Turing test, and I actually have the students play the gendered version of the imitation game. I have two students go out in the other room, and we sort of text message back and forth with the rest of the class, asking them questions about trying to figure out which one's the man and which one's the woman, or the boy and the girl. And so with high school students, it's very clear almost immediately in this game that they start asking very stereotypical questions about gender. So try to figure out if it's a girl, they ask, what kind of makeup do you wear, what size bra do you wear. If they're asking the boy, they ask me what kind of video games do you play, or what's your favorite kind of tennis shoe. These questions might work to distinguish gender, but they might get it wrong. They're grounded in stereotypes about what the typical behavior of the gender is. So Turing suggests in his paper that we use the same sort of setup of the imitation game, but this time in order to see if a computer can think. Turing isn't actually clear about whether he means for the computer to distinguish itself from a human, or if he means for the computer to pretend that it's male, and then there's a female playing, pretending that she's female, trying to fool the human about the gender. But in any case, the Turing test that we receive, or the sort of popular understanding of the Turing test, is that you have a computer sort of in one room and a human being in another room, and then you have the judge, which is C on this diagram. C can ask questions to both A and B, and C's job is to distinguish the computer from the human. Can you determine which one is the real human and which one is the machine? You can ask any question you want. The computer is trying to get the human to believe that the computer's a human, and the human's also trying to get the human to believe that the human's a human, and the human's job is to try to distinguish the two. So Turing says if the judge can tell the difference between a computer and a human, then the computer's probably not that intelligent. But if that's not actually true. The computer might be intelligent and just might fail at this test. But the idea is that if the computer can fool the judge into making the judge believe that the computer is human, right? If the judge asks questions and goes, yeah, that's a person, but then it turns out it's actually a computer, well, then we should judge the computer intelligent. In other words, if the computer can behave the way that we would expect a human being to behave, or sort of the normal human or stereotypical human, if the computer behaves sort of stereotypically human, then we should judge the computer is intelligent. In other words, the criteria for the Turing test here is something like that the machine behaves indistinguishably from a human. When is the computer intelligent? When the computer behaves sufficiently like a human that another human judge cannot tell them apart. If the computer fools a human judge that it's into thinking that it's human, then the computer is judged to pass the test. In Turing, on Turing's criteria, we should consider the machine intelligent. In his paper published in 1950, he says in 50 years' time, so by the year 2000, we should expect computers to convince judges after 5 minutes of conversation about 30% of the time. So Turing doesn't expect that we convince the judges 100% of the time by the year 2000. He's thinking that only 30% of the time will the machine give a convincing performance. In other words, at 70% of the time, the human will be able to tell that it's not a human, that it's a computer. I don't have a slide for this. So people like to argue that Turing was wrong because in the year 2000 we didn't have machines that could fool 30% of the judges into thinking that was human. Maybe the closest that we have is Eugene Goostman. In 2014, in 2014, on the 60th anniversary of Turing's death, they held a sort of exhibition match for the Turing test, where they got some computer science professionals to act as judges, and then some humans and some computers, chatbots, sort of tried to fool the judges. In fact, they run this kind of prize every year. It's called the Loebner Prize. And the Loebner Prize is the sort of official running of the Turing test. They do it every year. You can see that here's a list of winners. Jabberwocky Lbot. I think Lbot is one of the precursors to Cleverbot, if you've ever played with Cleverbot. Mitsuko is the current champion, is sort of the most convincing robot. I don't think anything in the official Loebner Prize is bested 30% of the judges. But Eugene Goostman at this sort of exhibition match, this wasn't an official Loebner Prize match, but it was a sort of exhibition match on the the anniversary of Turing's death. Goostman did convince 33% of the judges that it was human, thereby passing the Turing test. So the idea, or at least passing Turing's sort of minimal criteria. Turing was 14 years off, but that's just a fraction of the 50 years that he was judging the future by, so he's pretty close, within a reasonable margin of error. A lot of people aren't happy with the Eugene Goossman results. I think that it's sort of illegitimate. A lot of people have complained about this. Scott Aronson, who's a well-known blogger, was one of the judges at the event, and you can see a little transcript of Scott's interaction with Eugene. One thing to note here is that Eugene presents itself as a 13-year-old Ukrainian boy. And because he's from Ukraine and because he's fairly young, he doesn't know a lot of American pop culture references. He's sort of awkward with the language because it's not his first language. This kind of thing. Right? These are supposed to sort of explain why Eugene Goossman sort of talks in the stilted, maybe slightly inhuman way that it does. Well, because he's speaking in a foreign language and this kind of thing. So here's this transcript with Scott Aronson. So Scott asks, which is bigger, a shoebox or Mount Everest? And Eugene says, well, I can't make a choice right now. I should think it out later. I forgot to ask where you're from. Scott says, how many legs does a camel have? Something between 2 and 4, maybe 3. I still don't know your specialty. Possibly I missed it. Notice that Eugene keeps trying to divert the discussion, make Scott talk about something else, trying to bait him into a conversation. But Scott doesn't take the bait. Asks how many legs does a millipede have? Eugene says just 2. And then Scott asks again, no, I want to find out if you're a chatbot. Please just answer me straightforwardly. How many legs does an ant have? And Eugene says something between 2 and 4, maybe 3. So notice that it's the exact same quote here, and this is exactly what Scott Aronson is trying to do. Scott Aronson is sort of asking the same question, or sort of variations in the same question over and over again, to see if the machine gets caught in this sort of repetition, because usually human beings, especially in a chat conversation like this, won't give the exact same smiley for smiley response in their conversation. So this is suggesting there's something up that's it's using an algorithm of some sort. So Scott Aronson wasn't fooled, but in the event, 33% of the judges were fooled. And so maybe that counts as a passing the Turing test. You can argue about it in the discussion forums, I guess. So the normal way of understanding the Turing test is that Turing is insisting on indistinguishability, that computers need to behave like humans in order to be considered intelligent. And for this reason, a lot of people don't like the Turing test. A lot of people think the Turing test is not sufficient for testing the intelligence of machines. In particular, they say, well, look, it might be all fine and good for a machine to behave well enough to fool a human, but humans are pretty gullible. We're very likely to interpret, a bush rustling in a forest. I might think that there's someone hiding in the bush and there's someone going to jump out and get me or something. Maybe it's just the wind, but we have this sort of hyperactive need to identify other agents or to think that other agents are there. This is why, when you're home alone, but the house is creaking around you, sometimes you get the willies because you sort of get this idea that someone's around, maybe watching you. Of course, it's not true, but you have the sense that there's someone else there, even when there's not. And it's very easy to fool a human into thinking that that the computer's a person, or that it's behaving sort of similar enough to a person. So if Turing says that machines are intelligent when they behave like people, a lot of people say no, that's not right. Turing's test is not sufficient for testing intelligence. You get a lot of false positives with Turing tests. People are going to identify machines as intelligent when they're really not intelligent, like Eugene Goossman. Maybe that was clever enough to fool a couple of people, but it's really not any kind of deep intelligence. So Turing's test is not sufficient. This is usually the argument against Turing's test. But I think this argument misses the point of Turing's test. So Turing is not. He's really not committed to the idea that intelligence is just behaving however humans behave. What he's really interested in is how do you judge a machine fairly? I mean, we've already talked about this in respect to other issues in consciousness. The problem of other minds. I don't know the nature of other minds. I can't see from inside another person's perspective. I'm always outside of other people's perspective. I'm only ever inside my own perspective, right? So if I can't know the minds of other people, but I still believe that they have minds, right? So how do I judge the intelligence of machines? I might sort of, in a biased way, think that machines can never be intelligent, and so no computer can think. but Turing doesn't think this is very fair to the machine. Turing, on my interpretation, so let me clarify again, this is not the standard interpretation, but I think this is the correct interpretation. On my interpretation, Turing is not committed to intelligence behaving exactly like humans. Instead, what Turing is really most interested in is judging the machine fairly. That if you didn't have the machine in another room and you saw that it was a computer, you'd immediately go, okay, that's not really thinking. It doesn't matter how impressive its performance is. It doesn't matter how interesting or complex or novel its behavior. As soon as you see that it's a machine, as soon as you know that it's a machine, you're going to disbelieve it. Maybe this is one reason for skepticism about Scott's criticisms in this article. From this chat snippet. Scott is clearly questioning the witness here with sort of hostile interrogation. People fold all the time under hostile interrogation. If you're in the in a police station and they're questioning you and they're throwing different questions at you over and over again, it might get you caught up in some mistake or confusion, and you might give a wrong answer in that kind of hostile interrogation. So maybe it's not surprising that Eugene also folds under hostile interrogation. But what Turing really wants is to judge the machine fairly. In fact, he says this over and over again in an earlier work predating the 1950 paper when he's giving a lecture to the London Mathematical Society, and he's thinking about how do you test the intelligence of these machines, and he suggests actually playing chess as a way of testing the intelligence of machines, because chess provides this sort of neutral game where the machine can do everything that the human also can do. Right? The pieces are all available to both players. The rules are exactly the same for both players, and so the idea is that chess provides a sort of neutral playing field on which you're really testing the intelligence of the machine versus the human being. Right? So Turing says fair play for machines. What the Turing test, or what Turing calls the imitation game, what I think it's really about is providing a way of judging the machine fairly, of sort of filtering out human biases against machines, and for judging the machine on the merits of its own performances. After all, this is how we judge the intelligence of people. Right? We look at what they do, how they behave. Right? If I want to see how intelligent you are, I start asking you questions. And after a few minutes of questioning, I can figure out pretty well if you're an intelligent person, if you're maybe not so intelligent person, if you're in a coma. Right? After a few minutes of questioning, it's pretty clear if you're in a coma or not. Turing's concern is that we don't give the same opportunity or the chance to prove itself to the machine. As soon as we see that it's a machine, we say that it can't be a thinking thing, so we just discount any of its performances. So the Turing test is meant to provide a way for the machine to demonstrate its capacities at an intellectual task, like holding a conversation. Right? And Turing argues that you have to give the machine a chance to talk to you before sort of prejudging whether or not the machine can think. You have to look at what the machine actually does, look at its performances, look at how well it interacts with you. Again, this is how we judge the intelligence in other people. I can't see inside the person's head. I assume they think like I do because we're both human beings, but I never know for certain of what's going on in the other person's head. But I still judge them intelligent by their behavior, so I should use the same criteria for judging the intelligence of the machine. So this is Turing's sort of positive argument for intelligence, and just to go through the structure of the paper, he suggests that the imitation game takes the place of the question, can machines think? And then he sort of proposes the imitation game, and then he spends a couple of pages talking just about how computers work. The machines concerned in the game are digital computers, and so he talks a little bit about how digital computers work. He talks about state machines and control units and so on. He goes through how computation works. He hasn't really told you anything about how thinking works. He's really just talked about the imitation game. But then from there, he talks about the universality of computers. He gives the universal computers argument that I give. And then instead of justifying his position in any deeper way, he turns immediately to objections. He actually considers a whole host of objections here. He actually starts, before he starts the discussion, he says just really quickly, the question, can machines think, I believe, too meaningless to deserve discussion. Nevertheless, I believe at the end of the century we'll have machines that can pass 30% of the time. So Turing thinks that the question, can machines think, is too meaningless to deserve discussion. He thinks it's too... I mean, philosophers have been arguing for thousands of years about what thinking is, what intelligence is, what machines are. There's no clear answers to these questions. Sorry about this. I'm getting text bombed. Okay. Yeah, the machines. Yeah, so philosophers spent thousands of years arguing about what thinking is and what machines are. It's not like we're going to settle that question to decide whether we're intelligent. So we shouldn't have to decide this question in order to determine whether machines are intelligent either. Okay, so that's what Turing says in benefit or in support of his position. And then he just deals with objections. There's a bunch of objections here. I'm just going to go through a couple of them. The theological objection that God has given man an immortal soul, but did not give anything. Give men and women immortal souls, but not give any soul to animals or machines. So therefore, no animal or machine can think. Notice that Turing sort of throws in the animals and the machines as part of the same sort of grouping here into the theological objection. So maybe I should say that Turing's an atheist. Turing doesn't believe in God, and Turing sort of isn't very keen on this kind of objection. But Turing's response to this objection is not just to say, oh, God doesn't exist or souls don't matter. Instead, Turing's response is to say, okay, if you think souls are important, why can't computers have a soul? I mean, if God is all-powerful and God gives us a soul, why can't an all-powerful being also give animals and machines souls? Right? Now, again, Turing doesn't believe that the soul is important for machines to think. But what Turing is pointing out here is that the argument that machines can't think because only things with souls can think, that this isn't really sufficient for distinguishing the machines from human beings. The reasons for thinking that we have a soul might as well apply to the machines also, right? If God gives us a soul, why can't God give machines a soul? So the reason I belabor this point, even though it's kind of a silly argument, is because this is really the style of the rest of his treatments of these objections. His point is never to deny the claim of the objection, but instead to say, well, why can't that same property, whatever property you think is important, why can't that same property apply to machines? So theological objection, let me scroll down a little bit and go to some of these other objections. The argument from consciousness. So Turing has this conversation with Professor Jefferson on a BBC debate, in a sort of a formal debate on the BBC. And in this debate, Jefferson says, not until a machine can write a sonnet or compose a concerto, that because of thoughts and emotions felt, and not by the chance fall of symbols, could we agree that a machine equals brain. That is, not only write it, but know that it had written it. No mechanism could feel, and not merely artificially signal an easy contrivance. No machine could feel pleasure at its successes, grief when its valves fuse, be warmed by flattery, be made miserable by its mistakes, be charmed by sex, be angry or depressed when it cannot get what it wants. So Professor Jefferson says that these are things that machines cannot do. These are things that are associated with consciousness, composing a concerto or writing a sonnet because of thoughts and emotions felt. But no machines can do those things. No machines can, machines don't care about whether it loses games or wins games, these kinds of things. So again, Turing's argument here is not that consciousness doesn't exist, or that that humans aren't consciousness or anything like that. Turing's point is, Turing's argument, response to this objection, is, well, how do we tell that people are conscious? Right? Again, I don't see the conscious state of the person, so how do we tell that people are conscious? Well, we tell by talking to them. Right? So when you demand that the machine is conscious in order to be a thinking thing, you also have to ask the question, how do we tell when the machine's conscious? And Turing says, well, you got to ask them. You got to ask them questions that will reveal their conscious state. So if you think that writing a component because of thoughts and emotions felt is important, then ask it questions about poetry. So Turing actually provides a little snippet of his sort of imagined conversation. with a potential computer, where they're talking about poetry. They're talking about not just the sort of meter and verse, the formal characteristics of the poem, but they're also talking about the contents of the poem, what the different terms mean, the different connotations of the terms, and how, a winter's day might be a bad thing, but Christmas Day might be a good thing or a positive thing, even though Christmas Day is a winter's day, but it's a different kind of winter's day, and so, this is an ambiguity, a sort of subtle ambiguity in the meaning of these words, Turing's point here is that if you're having a conversation with the computer and it's making these kinds of distinctions, then maybe it is composing a sonnet on the basis of thoughts and emotions felt. If you don't think so, keep interrogating it and see if it shows you any better. For something that's sufficiently dumb, maybe it's pretty clear right away that it's giving you the same responses over and over again, that it's not very intelligent. But if something's giving you very complex, nuanced responses that are sensitive to all of the vagaries and ambiguities of language, this is exactly what we use to judge the intelligence of other human beings. So if a computer can reproduce this kind of behavior, then shouldn't we judge the machine intelligent also? I think Turing's argument here is pretty convincing. He gives one more sort of version of the same argument. The next one is the argument from various disabilities. So the previous argument was the argument from consciousness, that you need to be conscious. But maybe we can sort of generalize this to that, there's something that machines can't do, some X that machines cannot perform. So he offers a selection of things that machines cannot do. They cannot be kind, be resourceful, be beautiful, be friendly, have initiative, have a sense of humor, tell right from wrong, make mistakes, fall in love, enjoy strawberries and cream, make someone fall in love with this, learn from experience, use words properly, be the subject of its own thoughts, have as much diversity of behavior as man, do something really new. These are all sort of claims of things machines can never do. Enjoy strawberries and cream, fall in love, this kind of thing. This stuff is all, I think, familiar from our own conversations in class, our own sort of discussion of these issues. And again, Turing's response here is, how do we tell that machines, how do we tell that a person falls in love? We tell by their behavior. So if the machine behaves in a way that looks like it's falling in love, maybe we judge the machine can fall in love. Okay. So there's one more objection that Turing considers that I want to come back to in just a second, but I want to sort of jump ahead to a different argument that comes much later. But it's very popular, very well known, and it's sort of in the style of this argument from consciousness or argument from various disabilities. This is Searle's Chinese room argument. Searle publishes this in 1980, so this is 30 years after the Turing test. It's like 25 years after Turing dies. But Searle's argument here is really designed to show that the Turing test is not sufficient, along the lines of these various disabilities, that there's something that machines cannot do. And what Searle's going to argue is that what machines cannot do, or at least what computers cannot do, is understand. The machines are not capable of understanding. Searle says, my car and my adding machine understand nothing, they're not in that line of business. And so Searle's argument is by way of the Chinese room. So here's Searle, he's in this room. Searle says, I understand English fluently. I understand French and German, not as well, but okay, I can read French and German. But Searle says, I understand Chinese not at all. I don't understand a lick of Chinese. All of the symbols, Searle says, are meaningless squiggles and squaggles to me. I can't make heads of tails of it. I know nothing of the Chinese language, Searle says. But he's in this room, and the room is set up so that there's an input monitor, and there's a certain output slot, and there's all this sort of data storage inside this room that Searle has access to. In addition to all of this sort of infrastructure, Searle also has this rule book. And the rule book, so it's not a translation manual. It doesn't convert Chinese to English so that you can understand what's going on. Instead, the rule book tells you how to convert Chinese, some Chinese symbols to other Chinese symbols, right? So if you get something on the input, then put these other symbols on the output. So the rule looks like here on the screen. So if you see this shape followed by this shape followed by this shape, then on the output put this shape followed by this shape. Right? The idea is that you don't have to understand, right? So the rules are written in English. You don't have to understand anything about Chinese in order to follow these rules. All you need to know is how to look at the shapes and sort of pattern match, the structure of the shape. And as long as you're sort of able to see what the shapes are and compare them to other shapes, then you can follow these rules. Searle says, and if he practices enough at it and he gets good enough at it, maybe he can produce the output really quickly on the basis of the input, right, if he's able to go through the rule book really quickly. But following these rules doesn't give Searle any better understanding of what Chinese is or what Chinese means or how the language works at all. Or he's just sort of following these patterns. But Searle says, if you have the right rule book, if you have a clever enough rule book with enough data to back it up, then you might be able to program that rule book to give sensible answers to questions given on the input. So from outside the Chinese room, anyone who's interacting with the Chinese room, it looks like the Chinese room speaks Chinese. It passes the Turing test. It behaves in the sort of conversational language use way that looks indistinguishable from any other fluent Chinese speaker. You give it inputs in Chinese, and shortly thereafter it produces outputs, also in Chinese, that are sensible and appropriate and correct responses to the questions that you ask, in a way that you can keep asking these questions and sort of hold a conversation with the Chinese room and get sort of sensible responses. So from the outside of the Chinese room, it looks like whatever's inside the Chinese room is a fluent Chinese speaker, understands Chinese perfectly well. But Searle says, but look, I'm inside the Chinese room, and all I'm doing is following these rules where I'm sort of pattern matching on these shapes. And I don't understand anything about Chinese, no matter how many rules I follow. And then Searle says, but this is exactly the position that computers are always in. Computers are always just following these formal rules where they're really just matching patterns of ones and zeros. If you have this input of ones and zeros, produce this output of ones and zeros. Computers are able to do this really, really fast, and maybe fast enough to convince anyone looking at the computer or interacting with the computer that it's intelligent and can think. But Searle says, but in fact there's no intelligence going on inside whatsoever, there's no understanding going on. It's just this sort of mindless rule following. And that mindless rule following is never enough for intelligence or understanding. Searle, the catchphrase here is that syntax is not sufficient for semantics. Syntax is like the formal properties of the language, the sort of pattern, the shape, where semantics is the meanings of the words required to understand what the words mean. And what the computer is doing is just sort of syntactical processing. It's just processing syntax, but it's never processing the semantics, the content or meaning of those words. In fact, Searle argues that no amount of syntactical processing will ever give you semantics. That's just not the kind of thing. Semantics is something different than just rule-following pattern matching. So if the Chinese room, if Searle in the Chinese room doesn't understand Chinese, then computers are never in a position to understand anything. They're just pure rule followers. Searle doesn't tell you how he understands Chinese. He doesn't tell you, what explains his capacity to understand Chinese. But he's convinced that it's something to do with his brain, some biological process in his brain that allows him to understand Chinese. The important point here is that it's very clear to him that he understands Chinese. It's very clear to him that he understands English, but he doesn't understand Chinese at all, and that no amount of following these rules will give him better understanding of Chinese. Okay, so there's a couple of. This is a very popular argument. People often say that syntax is not enough for semantics, or that computers are just sort of syntactic processors. They're just computing binary digits, and they're not really doing any computing work. They're not really doing any intelligent work, capable of consciousness or understanding or anything. So Searle's paper is actually formatted a lot like Turing's paper, where he gives his proposal, the Chinese room argument, and then instead of defending the substantive view about the mind, explaining how understanding works, he instead just sort of punts that and talks about objections to his view. I want to talk about two objections here, the robot's reply and the system's reply. So the robot reply says, okay, so maybe the problem here is just that the kinds of inputs and outputs that Searle has access to when he's in the Chinese room are just too weak or insufficient. They're just insufficient for genuinely intelligent actions. But, a real human being doesn't just learn from looking at symbols and processing symbols. They're engaged with the world, right? They're seeing visual stimulus and auditory stimulus. They're getting a sort of complex picture of the world. Much more complex than anything the Chinese room gets. So maybe that's what's wrong. Maybe if we give the Chinese room more sophisticated sensory inputs, video cameras, microphones, and so on. And maybe if we give it more complicated outputs, motor outputs, give it some legs or some wheels, let it move around the world, and then sort of get the sensory input from the world. In other words, maybe if we turn the Chinese room into a robot, does that help at all? More elaborate sensory inputs, more elaborate sensory outputs. it's still doing the rule following inside, but the inputs and output functions are a lot closer to what we would expect from an intelligent creature. Does that make the Chinese room any more intelligent, turning it into a robot? And Searle says no, it doesn't. Even if you give it more sophisticated sensory apparatus or motor outputs, it's still funneling all that hardware through a central processing unit that's really just turning it into binary code. This is how digital computers work. It's just turning it into binary code and then processing at a very basic formal computational level. It's just syntax. So maybe you have these high-level inputs, but that's all reducing down to sort of mere binary code, and no amount of binary processing is going to be enough for semantic understanding or conscious intelligence or anything like that. Okay, so Searle doesn't think the robot reply works. So here's another reply, the systems reply. Searle says the Chinese room doesn't understand anything, but Searle's only looking at his own understanding of Chinese. He's looking in his own head to see if he understands Chinese. And you might say, well, look, there's a lot more going on in the Chinese room than just you, Searle. So you're one of the things in the Chinese room. But there's a lot of other things in the Chinese room. In particular, there's that rule book. That rule book has to be pretty sophisticated in order to give the right outputs to Chinese inputs. In other words, a lot of the understanding of Chinese isn't in the head of the processor here. It's really in the rule book. It's in the rules that the processor is following. So Searle thinks the Chinese room shows that there's no understanding, but he's just looking in the wrong place for the understanding. The understanding isn't in his brain. The understanding is in the book. On this view, Searle doesn't understand Chinese, but the Chinese room as a whole does understand Chinese. Right? The whole system, including Searle as the processor, including the rule book as the algorithms or the programs that he's following, the whole system taken together is what understands Chinese, not just Searle. Searle says that anyone who makes this kind of argument must be in the grip of some ideology or ideological delusion. Searle says, if I don't understand Chinese, adding bits of paper won't help me understand any better. So Searle completely rejects the systems reply. Searle thinks that if there is any understanding at all, it has to be going on in his head, but it's not going on there, so there's just no understanding. But I think this sort of rules out the game. If you include the program into the operations of the system, then there is understanding of Chinese, I want to say. It's just not where you'd expect to find it. So I don't know if you like that reply to Searle, or if you think Searle's arguments are convincing. Again, this is something you can talk about in your papers for Unit 3. But before going on any further here, I got lost. Sorry. One more objection. This is the objection that Turing actually considers in his paper, which is the Lovelace objection, Lady Lovelace's objection. Lady Lovelace's objection is that the analytical engine has no pretensions to originate anything. It can only do what we know how to order it to perform. Lovelace goes on. It can do whatever we know how to order to perform. It can follow analysis, but it has no power of anticipating any analytical truths or relations, or analytical relations or truths. It provides us. Its province is to assist us in making available what we are already acquainted with. Turing summarizes this as saying computers only do what we tell them to do, or computers only do what we program them to do. So I think this is the strongest argument against artificial intelligence. It's also extremely common. Almost everyone knows this argument and cites it whenever someone says the machines can think. Well, no, it's not really thinking. It's doing what we programmed it to do. And again, Lovelace was making this argument back in the 1800s, before computers were even around. So Turing takes this argument seriously, and he actually gives two different responses to it in his 1950 paper. The first response he gives right away, he says that sometimes machines surprise us. Turing's first response to Lovelace is that sometimes machines surprise us. Look, machines don't always do just what we tell it to do. If you've ever worked with a computer, if you've tried to program a computer, or even just like operating a computer, you know computers do all sorts of weird things that you don't really understand what it's doing or why it's doing it. You know, sometimes my computer will disconnect from the internet and then reconnect, and I don't know why. Sometimes my phone crashes for who knows what reason. Sometimes my computer crashes, and I don't know why as the user, and so I call technical support to try to find out why, and it goes through everything, all the diagnostics, and the technical support person also says, you know, I have no idea, I don't know what's going on. You know, you have to just uninstall and reinstall Windows or something. So if I, as the user, and the technical support, as the designer of the machine, don't know what the machine is doing, then, I mean, clearly machines don't always do what we tell them to do. Sometimes they just break down, or there's bugs or errors. Now, this doesn't mean that the machine is intelligent, just because it's doing things other than what we tell it to do, right? If it has a bug in the code or whatever. I mean, in some sense, the bug in the code is what we told it to do, but maybe we weren't anticipating all the results from it, and so the machine starts doing things that we didn't know that it was going to do, or we didn't anticipate it was going to do. Again, this doesn't mean that the machine is intelligent, but what Turing is reminding us is that we don't have total control over these machines just because we build computers. And, you know, when I say we build computers, I don't build computers. There's a company that builds computers. There's engineers who build computers. I'm not those engineers. I'm not the ones who build the computers. So it's sort of already stating too much control to say that we build computers. But when computers are built, just because those computers are built doesn't mean that the builders have total control over what those computers do. Those computers are also still real-world objects. They're mechanisms in the real world. You know, they degrade. And just by being mechanisms, they're going to perform in ways that we're not always going to be able to anticipate. Right? The world is chaotic. So machines don't always do what we tell them to do. Sometimes they do other things that we don't anticipate just because they're machines. So this is Turing's first response to Lovelace's objection, although Turing admits that he doesn't think it's going to convince anyone. So Turing gives another response later on in the paper where he argues to build learning machines. Where Turing argues to build learning machines. So Turing argues that if a machine can learn, then it can. Then maybe we should consider it as addressing Lovelace's objection. We should stop and think about Lovelace's objection for a second. So Lovelace's. Do I have a? I don't have a picture of this. So Lovelace's objection is different from the other kinds of objections, like Searle's Chinese room argument, the argument from consciousness, the argument from various disabilities. All of those objections are of the style that there's something that machines cannot do. You know, machines cannot be conscious. Machines cannot. I'm sorry. Machines can't be conscious. Machines can't enjoy strawberries and cream or fall in love. Machines can't understand anything. These are things that machines cannot do. Lovelace's objection doesn't quite work like this. Lovelace doesn't say that there's something machines can't do. In fact, Lovelace admits that machines can do whatever we know how to order it to perform. The issue here isn't that there's something off limits to the machine. The issue is that anything the machine does, no matter what it does, is something that we told it to do. And so its behavior sort of depends fundamentally on our ordering it, our programming it. So it's not that there's something that's off limits to the machine performance. Machines can do whatever. But they're limited not by their mechanical nature, but they're limited by our design. So the limitation is sort of on us. We're the ones who constrain the machines. Not because there's something inherently the machines can't do, but because there's limitations on what we know about what the machine can do. The way I like to understand this is that Lovelace is not arguing against artificial intelligence in the sense that there's something that the machines cannot do. Instead, Lovelace is arguing against artificial autonomy, that whatever the machine does, it's always sort of partially under our control or the result of our ordering. So this is where Turing gives the second response. Turing says, if you want machines, then don't just do what we tell it to do, then build learning machines. If a machine learns, Turing argues, if a machine learns, then what it ends up doing is not just the result of its programming, but it's also the result of its learning, of what it acquired from engaging the world and learning from it. Really, it's learning that yields autonomy. It's from our capacity to learn that makes us not just intelligent, but independent and autonomous agents. My parents taught me a lot of things. I had teachers when I was growing up but the things I do, even though I'm heavily indebted to my parents and to my teachers, I take myself as doing something new because I learned from them, and so I'm applying it myself. And so the idea is that if you build a machine that learns, then it's not just doing what we tell it to do, but it's also doing what it learned to do as a result of its experiences. Consider, for instance, learning something like long division. There's an algorithm for long division that everyone learns in like 5th grade or whatever. The first time, if I have a student who doesn't know how to do long division, I might walk them through the problem for the first time, every step of the way telling them exactly what to do in the algorithm. The first time we go through that problem, the student really doesn't know what's going on. It's the first exposure to the algorithm. So if I ask, did they solve the problem? Do they understand how to do long division? I'd have to admit, as a teacher, no, they don't understand. I was really the one who did the problem, and they were just sort of following along. But if we keep doing this over weeks and months, eventually the child learns how to do long division. And how do I tell that the child has learned to do long division? When the child can do it on their own, when the child can walk through every step of that algorithm without me holding their hand and without me directing them and telling them what to do at every step. That's not to say that the child develops a brand new algorithm for solving long division. None of us have developed a brand new algorithm for solving long division. All of us do long division following the same algorithms that we learned from our teachers, we learned from our parents. So the criteria here is, did you learn a new way of doing the behavior? No, it's not that you learned a new way of doing the behavior. It's just that you learned to do it by yourself. You learned to do it autonomously. Right? A student has learned when they can do that same thing by themselves. When they haven't learned, when they're just starting, when they're a novice, I have to sort of hold their hand the whole way. But I know that they've learned. I can judge that they've learned when they can do it on their own. So Turing's argument here is similar. If we want to build intelligent machines, then build learning machines that can do things on their own. They can learn on their own. And when those machines learn, then they're not just doing what we told them to do, they're also doing what they learned to do. Now yes, we programmed them to learn. Right? We gave them the tools in order to learn. But human beings, like I didn't come up with a brand new style of learning. I learn because that's how my brain learns, because that's the genetics I inherited. Those are the teachers I had. I didn't choose any of those things, right? Those are not my decisions. I just sort of benefit from all of this learning infrastructure. And then once I've learned and can do things on my own, then we consider me intelligent. So same thing with computers. When the computers learn to do things on their own, then the results of that behavior should be considered the genuine intelligent products of their activity. Right? In other words, learning machines get around Lovelace's objection. Lovelace thinks that machines only do what we tell them to do, but if a machine can learn, then what it does is genuinely its own result. So this is sort of why we've been, for the last couple of days, talking about these machines that do new things. Right? I'm pretty sure I've talked about these in class already. The robots that learn how to lie. They learn a deceptive trick through this evolutionary algorithm. No one told them to do that trick. They just learned how to do it on their own. But that was sufficient. That was sufficient to learn the task without anyone telling it what to do. Right? It's just the evolutionary process of learning builds machines that can solve this puzzle. We also talked about AlphaGo as learning from self-play. Right? AlphaGo doesn't learn from looking at any other human play. AlphaGo just plays itself, and through this process of self-play, it gets better and better over time until now it's the best Go player in the world. This is genuine learning, Turing wants to say, and it's evidence of the kind of not only that machines can think, but the machines think really well. Look, when a human being plays really good chess, we consider that human being intelligent. I'm going back to Kasparov. Right? Everyone thinks that Kasparov is intelligent. I mean, Kasparov might be stupid in lots of ways. Maybe Kasparov doesn't know how to parallel park or whatever. But Kasparov plays really good chess. It really doesn't matter how poorly Kasparov does at other things. Everyone thinks that if you play good chess, you've got to be pretty smart. And Kasparov plays chess better than anyone else, so we think Kasparov is intelligent. But then Deep Blue comes along and plays chess even better than Kasparov. If the reason we judge Kasparov as intelligent is because of Kasparov's chess play, then when Deep Blue performs the same way, we should judge Deep Blue intelligent also. It's only fair, right? Especially when these machines are learning how to do this on their own, when they're not doing this because we programmed it to do it, but they're doing it because they're clever enough to learn how to do it on their own, then it's almost completely unfair to withhold intelligence from the machine, to say the machine isn't intelligent, when it's doing something that if a human being were to do that same thing, we would consider the human being intelligent. Right? This is just fair play for machines. Alright, so I think I'm going to stop the video there. I've talked about the technical issues some technical issues with neural networks. I've talked about the history of artificial intelligence, and I've given some philosophical arguments for artificial intelligence. We still have more things to go, though. I want to say a little bit more about, maybe a little bit more about neural networks, but I also want to go through some of the ethical issues and eventually give you an argument in favor of robot rights. But we'll do that next week when we get back from break. I will go ahead and say goodbye right here. Thank you everyone for your patience listening to the lecture video and for me being away at the conference. Thank you very much. And I will see you on Thursday.